but I'm almost, this is kind of morbid, but I'm almost glad other things are happening to help me keep my eyes off of that, because I just don't want to watch it, although I'm still monitoring it. But as far as natural things, the earthquakes are just increasing, the magnitude, the frequency of the earthquakes. I don't know if you've seen what happened just over the last few days in the not the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean area, off of Puerto Rico and Cayman Islands, and it's just fascinating. It's fascinating because Jesus said all of this would be signs. Of course, he said that these would be the beginning. And now it's hard to say where the beginning's at. These things have been happening throughout history. But as far as an exponential increase, we can definitely say that these birth pangs are getting closer together. There's just no doubt about that. Every day a new volcano acts up. And there's never been in modern times this many volcanoes that are active and extremely active, which is interesting when you live on the west coast of the United States, interesting when you live in Oregon, because we got lots of them. So it would be interesting to see what happens in the future. I don't know if you've seen what's happening in Eastern Africa with the locusts. There's swarms, which of course we know that happens in countries where they have the outbreak of locusts, seasonally or every so many years. What is going on now in the eastern parts of Africa is unprecedented. They have never seen swarms like they've seen. I guess normally a swarm of locusts tends to be less than like a square kilometer. And there was one swarm, just for instance of what they're dealing with, there was one swarm, and these are rough numbers, I don't remember exactly, it was like 60 kilometers by 40 kilometers. That swarm itself was larger than any city on earth, just to give you an idea. Now, if you've been alive for any time, you know how hard Africa fights to have enough food. So sometime in the future, we can only imagine what's going to start happening there, because farm by farm by farm, everything's being eaten. They don't have enough of the equipment to eradicate them with chemicals, and of course that would lead to its own problems. But here's the crazy thing. Scientists, I was reading it today, scientists have said that based on what they're seeing now, that once the rains come and everything warms up, they think there could be a 500-time increase in what they're already seeing. I had to read that 3 times. 500-time increase. Sounds biblical. And then, of course, we have what's going on with the coronavirus. And I'm convinced as of today that I know everything and I know nothing about what's going on, because it depends who you listen to. And so you got to choose your sources, and you got to choose who you believe in, and you got to wait and see, like the whole world's doing. And I shouldn't say the whole world, because it is amazing how many people are just going on like nothing's happening. We have many cases that are being watched in the United States, confirmed cases, have no deaths yet. Maybe you saw that they flew a bunch of Americans out of China. They were supposed to land in Ontario, Los Angeles International Airport. They sent them off to March Air Force Base and have them in quarantine now on March Air Force Base out in the desert east of Los Angeles. So lots is happening. And I just want to keep you knowing. And again, as I tried to say on Sunday, and I know this falls on deaf ears with some of you, this isn't to bring fear. Here's a good study for you, not tonight, but here's a good study for you. Go home and study Psalm 91. Psalm 91, and let that be some peace as believers to the coverage that we have under the wings of our God. Because I believe we are covered in a lot of ways. But I also believe we're not to be remiss in responsibility. And so again, as I said on Sunday, you guys need to make some decisions about what you might want to do. And as I said to one of my sons, who I was trying to convince to buy some supplies, he lives up in Eugene, and he wasn't buying it, which doesn't surprise me with him. But he eventually budged, which I was really happy to see, and he did some things. But as I told him, I said, this may not be it, but it is coming. Depending upon how long the Lord waits to come for us. I mean, we will see more. If you have been looking, or if you haven't, things are running out and prices are going up. There's now a crisis across the country with storable food. Prices are skyrocketing and the supplies are backing up. And if you're going to buy storable food, ask me, I'll tell you a good reference, because a lot of them will promise you the world and you'll be waiting and waiting and waiting because they don't actually have what they say they have. Masks. You're at all interested in having some masks. Then there's so many various types, and I'm going to say this again on Sunday. I encourage you to shop that for yourself. They're running out. Every store that carries them in town, empty. What's happening is all over the country, the Chinese nationals are buying up all the masks and are shipping them back to China. I was listening to a guy who was in Arizona, and he was in his local Home Depot. He went down just to see what was available, and there was 2 Chinese nationals there. They bought everything on the shelf, like 10, 12 cases, and they've even taken the duty off of sending them so that they made it easier on those. And it's ironic because that's where they were all produced. So now they're all going back. But the prices are going up, and you go on Amazon, currently unavailable. They were just available a few days ago. Something you bought for $19 2 days ago, $39, $49, going up. As a church, though, one of the things we leadership had a meeting with the elders the other day, and we have some long-term food storage that we began years ago for these kind of things, because most of you remember Ken. Ken was the associate pastor here, and he passed away 3 years ago. But he had a very strong vision for this church. And then that vision, I'll retell it if you haven't heard it in a while. In his vision, he saw this church lined with shelves all through the church. And on the shelves were supplies of every kind. And people were coming in, and they were panicked. And all he knew is something really bad had happened outside. But we were in the position to help. And so we kind of started that long-term food pantry. Kind of waned and kind of died off. We're trying to get some more interest in that. But we just made a purchase as a church of some long-term food storage so that we could help someone in the body who, if that time came and doesn't have enough to quarantine themselves at home, that we might be able to help with that. To say, here's some long-term food, stay in your house for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. But take a look at what you've got, take a look at what you need. Because if it ever hit, which, pray to God, I hope a month from now you're going, Glenn, that was ridiculous that you even spent time speaking about that. I'll own that. I'll be happy. But if it ever swept through here, we may come to that point. And with that, I'll say this. If you've never looked at our YouTube channel, if you have no idea how to get on YouTube, if you don't know how to get to the teachings that we put there, then either figure out how, ask somebody how, because if we ever get locked down, I'm going to do my best, as long as I have power at home, to continue to teach and post those so that we'll all be able to stay together, at least by that, if it ever came to that. And again, you may think I'm crazy. It's like, well, are we really talking about this? Yep. Yeah, we are. Because I'd rather talk about it and then laugh about it than get to a point where things break out and we never talked about it. So contingency thinking is worth it. And if you want to talk more about that, that's I'm more than willing. I've got more information in my head than you want to listen to. But I'm more than willing to talk about all this if you have any questions. Do you have any questions right now before we get started? In Roseburg, Oregon. Wow. We didn't rehearse that. Okay? That was a real life example. Thank you. Yeah, it's right here in Roseburg. And one of the I don't ever like to use the word scary. It's a dumb word. One of the areas of concern is that we live on the West Coast. And the epidemiologists, the virologists, all those people that know about these things, they keep talking about the danger of the West Coast cities. Because unfortunately, most of the West Coast cities they're already diseased. You look at San Francisco, you look at Portland. It's just an incubator waiting for something to be poured into it. So the cities is where they have the fear. Fortunately, we live where we live. Very thankful for that. Anyway, enough about that. Guys are all like heavy now. Oh, should have stayed home. One more thing. If you're going to look at supplies as far as personal protection, emergency medical workers call it PPE, personal protection equipment, don't go too crazy. Because the idea is that you don't want to be out in public if things broke out. You'd want to be staying at home. And at home, the most you'd want or need probably is a mask, especially if somebody that stops by after you've been home for a couple weeks, you don't know where they've been, and suddenly they want to stay with you. Well, you don't know where that person's been. And so if you're going to let them in your house, you better be protected from them, or you better have a way to isolate them for about 2 weeks to make sure they're not infected. But the thing that I remember from my military training, we used to call it NBC training, nuclear, biological, chemical. I think now it's called chemical, biological, radiological. But the thing is, you can put on all the protective gear you want and be able to walk through a really nasty situation. There's a problem. You got to take it off. And if you don't know how to wash down and you don't have the way to wash down, all you're going to do is contaminate yourself as you take it off. And none of us are really set up for that. And so you got to think about all those kind of different scenarios. I got to shut up. Let's go. All right. Is there time for 2 Samuel? Let's pray. Father, we just come to you tonight, Lord. I believe with just a request. Lord, before we even get to the word that you have for us tonight, I just believe that our request would be for peace, Lord. Peace in our minds, peace in our souls, Lord, settled hearts. And Lord, I know the only way we can have those things is to see you as our sufficiency, to see you as our cover. Lord, to place ourselves under the protection of your wing, and to know that you really do have our best interest at heart. But Lord, I also pray that you would give us wisdom, and along with that, knowledge. And Lord, you would give us your will for the place we see ourselves in this world at this time right now. Lord, I pray that there would be no fear in us as we see the very things that you told us would happen unfolding. I pray we would be more excited than ever fearful. But Lord, I do pray we'd be wise, and that you would give us wisdom as to the things we need to do for ourselves. We see examples in Scripture, Lord. There were famines, and people put away food for famines. And Lord, you gave that knowledge, you gave that wisdom, so there's a precedent for being ready. And so, Lord, I pray that you would just help us with that. But Lord, it is exciting. It's exciting to see your word just unfold. That everything you prophetically told us, Lord, is exactly as you said. And Lord, I don't know how long we wait. I don't know how close we are to your coming. But Lord, I pray we would remain strong. I pray that we would just get bolder as the days go by. Lord, that we would be the voice, Lord, that would point to these things that the world is seeing and go, I know why that's happening, and be able to take people to the word and say, here it is. Here it is. And Lord, with that, I cannot imagine going through these days without you. And so I'm so thankful for those of us that know you, are known by you. And Lord, for all those that we love, our friends, our family, our neighbors, Lord, that don't yet know you, Lord, I pray that these things would bring them to you. And so, Lord, what a privilege to be in these days, that you would preserve us for such times. that you would allow us to see the things that the prophets wish they could have seen. So Lord, as we open your word tonight, Lord, continue to take us through this book by your hand, Lord, for whatever it is here that you have for us tonight. We yield to your Spirit now. In Jesus' name, amen. So we come to chapter 17, and we continue this saga of David, the results of his own sin, the way that the consequences of his sin have kind of ripped through his family. As we came out of chapter 16, we see this conflict raising up between David's son Absalom, who we read earlier, returned from exile, was kept from his father for about 3 years, finally was able to see his father, and then now we have this conflict where David and those loyal to him have fled. Absalom has sort of taken the throne, and he's prepared now to really move out against David and his father and really put this thing to bed. But we're going to see God's hand that remains upon David. That David is God's anointed, and when God has an anointed, he'll do what needs to be done to protect that part of his will. As we were closing out chapter 16, we really had a concentration on this individual, Ahithophel, who we know was a counselor at one time to David, now a counselor to Absalom. Definitely has an agenda, definitely self-focused for his own edification as he gives this counsel. He's certainly out for David. He's certainly out to see David destroyed. We mentioned a couple weeks ago that it's interesting that Ahithophel is actually the grandfather of Bathsheba, who we know David sinned with and then killed her husband. And so it seems that the grandfather never really forgot that. And it may be a great part of his motivation. But we also saw in David's wisdom that he set certain things up in the city that he would have a way of getting intel. He put the priests and the ark back in the city. He put a couple men back in the city that they would be able to then take the intel that they had, bring it out to David where he was hiding so that David could stay abreast of what was going on. And then we see this other man that we'll remind ourselves of here as we get into Hushai. Hushai was really sent kind of as right into the midst of the courtroom by David to be a spy, and he came in promising his allegiance to Absalom as the king so that he could be close and also hopefully become a counselor to him in David's favor ultimately. And we need to remember too, as we closed out chapter 16, one of the ugly things we saw was the counsel of Ahithophel was for Absalom to take the concubines that David left behind to care for his house and to lie with them in the sight of all of Israel, and therefore really just bring shame against the house of his father. So they set up a tent on the roof, and he did that very thing in the sight of all Israel. So with that as some background, let's see how far we get tonight. Verse 1 says, "Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, 'Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will rise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak and make him afraid. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. Then I will bring back all the people to you. When all return except the man whom you seek, all the people will be at peace.' And the saying pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel." So Ahithophel gives this counsel, and he advises a quick, selective attack against David. And he says, "I will strike only the king." So in this advice, he advises urgency. Do it all while David is still west of the Jordan, hasn't crossed over yet. But it's interesting that he says, "I will strike only the king." It's kind of a slip of the tongue, kind of an unknowing prophecy, because deep in his heart, even if Ahithophel knew that David was the real king. And he says this to Absalom. And I don't know if Absalom missed that or what, but he says it in front of the man who now considers himself king. And it says, "And the saying pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel." Now his plan was smart, it was bold, it had a high probability of success, and it would actually spare Israel a protracted civil war between the supporters of David and the supporters of Absalom. So there was some wisdom there in his counsel. Let's pick up in verse 5. Then Absalom said, "Now call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he says too." Now this is the man that David put there as his spy, as his representative, but to get close to his son. Verse 6, and when Hushai came to Absalom, Absalom spoke to him, saying, "Ahithophel has spoken in this manner. Shall we do as he says? If not, speak up." So Hushai says to Absalom, "The advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time." For, said Hushai, "You know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and they are enraged in the mines, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is a man of war and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in some pit or in some other place. And it will be, when some of them are overthrown at the first, that whoever hears it will say, 'There is slaughter among the people who follow Absalom.' And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men." So it's interesting that he takes the counsel, Absalom does, of Ahithophel. And then he calls on Hushai to hear what he has to say as well, and actually puts him in a position of judging the other counselor's counsel. But you know, what we see here is the hand of God. The hand of God is answering David's prayer that he prayed back in chapter 15, verse 31. In that verse we read, it says, "Then someone told David, saying, 'Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom.' And David said," or David prayed, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And so God is at work here. As much as it might not seem so, as much as we see all this clamoring of people and people's ways, God is at work. So Absalom even asked for another opinion after such wise, well-received counsel. All the elders agreed with what they had heard from Ahithophel. And Hushai replies, "The advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time." That took some boldness just to say that right in front of the man. So Hushai thought quickly and offered a counter plan in order to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And David had asked him to do this also back in chapter 15, and I won't read that, but verses 32 to 35. And Hushai spoke of the David of the past, when you think about it, not the David of the present, saying that he was a mighty man. Hushai knew David was no longer truly a strong and mighty man. He hoped that Absalom would vividly remember the David of the past. He painted the picture that David and his men were dangerous and should not be attacked quickly. And you know, we can imagine that he said all this praying that God would indeed answer David's prayer and defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. I mean, I would imagine he had a prayerful heart as he was speaking these things. And as we've already pointed out, God was at work. God was answering that very prayer. Verse 11. "Therefore I advise that all Israel be fully gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, like the sand that is by the sea for multitude, that you go to battle in person. So we will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him there shall not be left so much as one. Moreover, if he has withdrawn into the city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to the city, and we will pull it into the river until there is not one small stone found there." Now this plan that this counselor gives is one that's going to take time. Hushai not only wanted to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, he also wanted to do whatever he could to buy David more time before the inevitable attack came. And then he says something very, very manipulative. He says to Absalom, he says, "And that you go to battle in person." So this suggestion probably fed Absalom's vanity. He could prove that he was a mighty soldier like the king, like his father, David. In Ahithophel's plan, Ahithophel led the battle. In Hushai's plan, Absalom leads the battle. And look at verse 14. "So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, 'The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel.' For the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. So again, it's pretty clear what's taking place. Hushai is directly in the will and in the will of God and to the answer by God of David's prayer. Now, as I already said, Absalom liked this plan because it really fed his ego. It really appealed to his vanity. Absalom definitely had a smart man on his side, but David's prayer was mightier than Ahithophel's smarts. God allowed Ahithophel to give great advice, and yet it was rejected. And what we get from this, like I said, as we read those verses, is God was in control. The Lord had purposed, it tells us, to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel. And really, that's the principle that's taught to us throughout the whole Bible. We cannot outrun God's plans. We very often try, but we truly can't. We can attempt to, but we will not escape the sovereignty of God or his power. God's will here is to bring disaster to Absalom. And that's exactly what will take place because God's will gets done. And all of this, though, we need to notice that God is chastening David. And David knew it. David definitely knew it. That's why he walked out of the city of Jerusalem with the sadness in his heart, understanding that so much, and we discussed that last week, was because of his own doings, his own decisions. But you know what? God didn't forsake David during this time of his chastening. And that's such an important thing for us to remember as children of God, that we may be chastened, but God doesn't put us away. He doesn't forsake us. And he's promised not to. He may chasten us, which means discipline. He may bring us into the face of hard lessons, but he doesn't forsake us. We're his children, and as a good father, he's raising us. And there's many things that he has to teach us, some of us over and over again. He was always there for David. He was not going to destroy David, but he would correct him. Look at verse 15. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, "Thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, saying, do not spend this night in the plains of the wilderness, but speedily cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up." Now, that's exactly what David had in mind when he sent Hushai and the priests back to Absalom. This was why he set this up, that this kind of intel would come to him. That system was in place, so when a decision was made, David would know, and the people that were with him could all make a decision and act accordingly. Verse 17. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stayed in En-Rogel, for they dared not be seen coming into the city. So a female servant would come and tell them, and they would go and tell King David. Nevertheless, a lad saw them and told Absalom. But both of them went quickly and came to a man's house in Bahurim, who had a well in his court, and they went down into it. Then the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth and spread ground grain on it, and the thing was not known. And when Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" So the woman said to them, "They have gone over the water brook." And when they had searched and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. Now it came to pass, after they had departed, that they came up out of the well and went and told King David and said to David, "Arise and cross over the water quickly, for thus has Ahithophel advised against you." So David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed over the Jordan. By morning light, not one of them was left who had not gone over the Jordan. Now that Jonathan and this Ahimaaz could find help along the way proved that it wasn't the whole nation that had gone over to Absalom. There were still those that didn't travel with David, but were still loyal to David. And I would believe, especially since he publicly disgraced David's concubines. I think that probably sold a lot of the followers that stayed behind, that they would be loyal to David, even though now it was a bit late for them to leave. Look at verse 23. Now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey, arose and went home to his house, to his city. Then he put his household in order and hanged himself and died. And he was buried in his father's tomb. So Ahithophel became despondent because his advice had been rejected and because he perceived that David would be victorious. So we see here he returns to his house, he sets all his household in order, and he hanged himself. And you know, it's interesting there because both in life and death, this man was sort of a type of Judas Iscariot in the way that he betrayed David, and then his end as well, and some of his motivations. Look at verse 24. Then David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed over the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. And Absalom made Amasa captain of the army instead of Joab. And Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jithra, an Israelite, who had gone into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. So Absalom pursued his father across the Jordan to Gilead, having appointed this new man, Amasa, as commander of his forces. And it tells here Amasa's father was an Ishmaelite by birth, but an Israelite by religion. And he was also David's nephew and a first cousin to Joab, who was the leader of the armies of David. Look at verse 27. Now it happened when David had come to Mahanaim that Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, of the people of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lo-Debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beads and basins, earthen vessels and wheat, barley and flour, parched grain and beans, lentils and parched seeds, honey and curd, sheep and cheese of the herd, for David and the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So here, while David was encamped at Mahanaim, these three men come to him with necessary, very necessary, non-perishable provisions for him and his people. Now, these three men, we could just kind of skip over it. And it was interesting because I read a couple commentaries who basically said these were like just non-important people, as if they had no history and God just arbitrarily included them, or just arbitrarily put their names in there for their sake. And it was interesting because when you study it out, they're not just nobodies, not that anybody's a nobody, but it was just interesting how casual some commentators were with these guys. But Shobi was the son of Nahash, who was the deceased king of the Ammonites. His brother Hanun had rejected David's goodwill and suffered for it back in chapter 10 of 2 Samuel. But Shobi, although by birth an alien, cared more for Israel's king than most of the Jews did, which is very interesting. And then we have this man here, Machir. He had cared for I can't stand saying this guy's name, Mephibosheth, for many years. Remember, that was the last surviving person from Saul's household. And this man cared for that son of Saul for many years until David brought him to Jerusalem and put him in the palace with him. And we see that he ministered to those in need, whether a lame prince or a dethroned king. And so there's a real character about these men that have brought these supplies. And then this last one, Barzillai, helped sustain David the entire time he stayed in Mahanaim. He was a very wealthy man, and his support meant a lot to the king. And we'll read about him and meet him again in the 19th chapter of this book. And on his deathbed, David told Solomon to elevate the sons of this last man to places in the royal court. So these weren't nobodies. These men all had a character that was worthy of mentioning. They all had history that tied in with David. They didn't just come from nowhere and disappear. But I think it's interesting that we can see a parallel here between the lives of David, and there's many of these. I mean, this isn't special in this way, but between the lives of David and our Savior, Jesus. Because when you think about it, many Gentiles that received Jesus, there were many Gentiles that received Jesus, but he was rejected by his own. And so you kind of see that, that you have these Gentile people that David has dealt with over time that has come to rescue this Jewish king while the majority of his Jewish countrymen are out to kill him. Very similar to what Jesus faced in his day. And observing the actions of these men, I think in a New Testament perspective, we should consider that those who give of their substance to aid the cause of Christ through hospitality will have their kindness returned 100-fold when he returns in his glory. And what a great promise. We hear about the promises of God of the crowns that we will receive and the way that he'll reward the things we've done for the kingdom. And so I always find that just to be a motivation. Because so many people, just because of our Western mindset, we want that carrot. We want something to run for that we can see. Well, there's something we can see. There's a reward in our service to the kingdom. And what's interesting is the things that we get to do here on earth for the kingdom, we'll never get to do again. Once we're in heaven with the Lord, once we're with him forever, the things we needed to do here, they're over. So we need to make the most of the time we're here in those things and know that there is a reward in heaven for those things. And it's just a beautiful picture within a beautiful picture. And the other thing is that Jesus won't forget those who have ministered to him. They will be given positions of honor in his kingdom. And how do we minister to him in these days? Well, there's the direct ways as an individual believer. We minister to him with our attention, with our heart, with our dedication to his word, in prayer, in worship, in walking in the Spirit. But we also do it, he taught us, when we do these things to the least of these. When we take care of those that don't have needs that we can meet, then God blesses that, because he says, when you do unto them, you do unto me. And he also goes on, the passage, he says, what you didn't do to them, you didn't do to me. So, my plan was to get through the next chapter, but we're not going to do that. I think we'll rest here for tonight because the next chapter is a long one as well. So questions or thoughts about anything we discussed tonight?